So the upshot is that we don't know what happened to that money, but we have investigations still going on, and we are cooperating with Iraqi authorities on investigations that they have still going on with respect to some of that money, large amounts of it.
This sounds, although you can't put a figure on it, like several $billion more of waste. I want to go up to the high-level picture, because your interviews, we've had press from the outside of the government writing books, and we've had a few memoirs, but yours is the official account, and you had access in interviews. Secretary Powell held his tongue for years, and you had that historic interview with him. And I want to ask you the significance of what he said. Undermined security, and in some ways jump-started the insurgency. And as your report says on page 76, when the Army was disbanded, Secretary Powell recalled, I called Dr. Rice and said, what happened? Nobody seemed to know about this. And her answer was, we have to back Jerry Bremer. We have to back Jerry. To me, this sounds not just like lack of coordination, but tolerance and even ratification at the very top of that disastrous decision. Can you explain the significance of that exchange?
Well, as a law professor, maybe I'll invoke the rule of optional completeness here, you'll understand, and finish that quote, because I think it adds an important aspect to that story. Secretary Powell went on to say, there was no meeting on it. There was no, gee, is this a good idea? You couldn't even tell who had decided it. I saw Peter Pace, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a little later, and I said, Peter, did you guys know about this? He said, hell no. And the other quote while we're looking at it is the one from General Petraeus, the last paragraph of that chapter. It says, Major General Petraeus later said that the order to disband the Army sparked an anti-coalition sentiment that fueled the nascent insurgency in Iraq, igniting nationalist impulses against the occupiers. Petraeus believed that the order created, quote, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of additional enemies of the coalition. I think those quotations speak for themselves.
Let me ask about more of this unique interview you had with Secretary Powell. He explained that the Department of Defense was inventing numbers of a new Iraqi army as that was started, and that this was for President Bush to believe as it became the prelude to disaster. He characterized the Defense Department this way. DOD kept inventing numbers of Iraqi security forces. The number would jump 20,000 a week. They said, he's now characterizing what they said. We now have 80,000. And I guess a week later, we now have 100,000. We now have 120,000. And he said, Mr. Rumsfeld is briefing this to the President. What is the significance of what Secretary Powell was saying?
Well, what he said was also echoed later on that page by Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez, who was commanding U.S. forces on the ground at the time, and by Ambassador Bremer, in charge of civilian effort. Secretary Rumsfeld has explained that those changing numbers were a function of changing metrics. But the upshot of the issue you're raising is about force levels and about responding to the security problem in Iraq. And I think the answer to your question is the surge. The fact is that a larger security presence was necessary to quell the insurgency and permit reconstruction to move forward. And until an effective counterinsurgency strategy was implemented by General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker, this issue of the numbers of troops was simply talk. It didn't really address the truth of the need for more U.S. security on the ground.
the surge after billions was wasted, not to mention the loss of life and the other catastrophes. I want to ask about the contracting, particularly how the agencies and their contractors spent their funds. As you noted a few minutes ago, building big design build projects, cost plus, as you say, with an open checkbook. I'd like to understand how we got from there to the present and future problem that we face, which we may have to hold hearings because it's a current waste problem. The largest source of waste, the sustainment crisis. Why is that the largest source of waste, and how much of a problem is it right now and going forward?
It remains a serious problem, but it's a problem that's being addressed. It is a problem in Iraq because it was not addressed in the Iraq Relief and Reconstruction Fund contracts. The plan was to build it and give it, not to build it and prepare them to take it and provide a bridge that will build their capacity so that they can receive it. That particular motif never figured into the CPA's vision because it wasn't expected to last that long, I would gather. But nevertheless, regardless of how long you expect it to last, if you're going to build, for instance, the state-of-the-art water treatment system in Nasiriyah, then you better know that when you turn it on, that the pipes in the villages that it serves aren't suddenly going to explode because it provides too much pressure to a system that is used to something much lower. To answer your question, is it a problem today? Yes, it's a problem today, but largely because of the asset transfer component to it. There was an asset transfer plan in place until about 18 months ago, and the Iraqis abandoned it. It was working, and as a result, a lot of projects since then have been unilaterally transferred to the Iraqis, which means with not a good sustainment plan. We have actually ongoing. And Brian, why don't you comment? Brian Flynn, my AIG for inspections, is carrying out and has been carrying out a series of sustainment inspections. And so I'd like him to talk for a minute about what he's learned from those visits to projects already finished that have been transferred to Iraqi control.
Actually, I suppose it's a mixed bag. For the most part, we're finding problems with sustainment. Chairman Thibault, you were with me at the Baghdad Police College. You witnessed the what was an adequate latrine turned over to the Iraqis that's been vandalized and through neglect is only about 2/3 usable at the present time. But we've also seen some things like we were recently at the Basra courthouse, where we're in the process of turning this over to the Iraqis. They're anxious to have the courthouse, and they are they bought and are in the process of installing some very nice furniture, so that there's arguably there an element of Iraqi participation in the cost of the courthouse. Same thing is true with respect to the Basra Children's Hospital. The planning for sustainment there is being done by the Project Hope people, by the Iraqi government. It's still a work in process. It's still somewhat behind in completion, but they will actually take possession of it February 7th. We'll be able to see some patients on a limited basis this summer, and the plan is for them to be able to see full patients in the fall. A lot of steps have to be taken for that to happen. So,
can you give just a brief overview of the sustainment program as a whole, what it will continue to look at over the course of this year, and what we in general have found?
I think what we will continue to do in terms of sustainment.
Sustainment, yes.
I'm sorry?
Sustainment program, right. Your sustainment inspection program.
We're looking at about 25% of the projects we look at are for sustainment by the Iraqis. Our normal inspections is we obtain data on the design of a project. We go out and visit the project and look at whether construction is in accordance with the design. We look at planning for sustainment. We look at the contractor's quality control and the government's quality assurance, and then we make a decision as to whether the project's going to meet its intended objectives. We also like to take projects that are 6 months to a year from having been turned over to the Iraqis and look at them and see how well they're being sustained. And that's basically determining the condition at the time of transfer to the Iraqis, and then the condition at the time that we look at it, see whether it's being properly sustained. It is a problem for the Iraqis. We've looked at this point, 4 primary health care centers as an example. Those are not being well sustained by the Iraqi government, and in fact, so poorly sustained.
Being well said. I didn't hear what you said.
I'm sorry, not. But the Iraqi Transition Assistance Office has funded $16 million contract for the Gulf Region Division of the Army Corps of Engineers to work with the Iraqis to do operation and maintenance, to train them in operation and maintenance. And we're finding things there, for instance, lack of people trained to use the X-ray equipment that was turned over to them, out-of-date film for the X-ray machines and so forth.
Thank you.
Okay.
My time
Thank you.
expired.
Thank you. Appreciate you staying a little longer,
Sure.
Stuart. We're going to ask you as we take one more run by the group here, we'll try to move you out so that we
Good.
can make our 12 o'clock deadline.
Great.
And I'll start that process by simply saying thank you and recognizing that for me, from my perspective, as I've been briefed up on numerous briefings, read numerous oversight organizations, numerous organizational reports and the like, much of what you say I've condensed down into, and we could say a lack of planning, but you know, this commission's about what do we need to learn and put in place so that we don't do it again, and to look back to gain knowledge to the future, not look back to pummel the past, but to certainly recognize it and prevent it. And I see the need for, Ms. Cruz mentioned much better strategic planning. You mentioned don't build projects for project's sake, which is planning. You mentioned, certainly we've talked about working with the Iraqi, in this case, the country, government, to make sure that you don't give them a project they don't want and they walk away from it. But we also talk about what Mr. Flynn just brought up, about the fact that we better be sure they're ready, even if it's a project they want, or it may go lacking or fall down or ultimately come into disuse. And the not replicating weak quality assurance has a special situation to me because that fits every single project.
That's right.
And it's been found over and over, and there's been an acknowledgement. And yet the question is what is truly being done by the actions, because you can have plans, you can acknowledge the need, you can put in an action plan, I'm going to get it done. And so for all of that, I just wanted to make the observation that kind of all rolls together for me, and thank you. And I'll move on to Commissioner Irvin.
General, returning to this theme of accountability and complementing the series of questions Commissioner Gustaitis asked about contractors, which contractors you hold most accountable to date for our failures in Iraq, I'd like to ask you to do the same thing with regard to government officials. There's been some discussion, considerable discussion of your view of Ambassador Bremer implicitly, but I'd like you to expand upon that explicitly and to expand the list to include other government officials to the extent that you think they bear some responsibility for what's gone wrong in Iraq.
Well, I would refer you first, with respect to Ambassador Bremer, to the epigraph to Chapter 7 from the Powell interview that we conducted last February, almost exactly a year ago. Jerry Bremer, God bless him, he was never given a set of coordinated instructions from the administration. He went in pretty much on his own. And I think that's true. So I'm not ready here to say it's his fault. What I can say is that there was a plan, as I talked about earlier, on March 10th that was approved And by May 6th, a different policy had been decided upon. And then how that was executed, is spelled out. I mean, there was clearly some deficiencies in how Ambassador Bremer managed the CPA. He's acknowledged that himself. I think, in retrospect, disbanding the Army is something he wouldn't do again. I think that banning any Iraqi from service in the government at the top 3 levels because they'd been a full member of the Ba'ath Party was a mistake. Essentially, fired what security you might have had, fired what expertise you had in the government. You had to start from scratch. You didn't just have to reconstitute ministries, you had to rebuild them, literally. And so I think that there are clearly, as we point out, Secretary Rice has acknowledged there are many things that went wrong and many things that she would do differently if she could. I think, though, that the story of Iraq reconstruction is the story of a policy that changed dramatically with respect to reconstruction in 2003, and then changed again, and then changed again. It changed from a focus on infrastructure to a focus on security, with not much building going on under Ambassador Negroponte. And then it changed on a focus on hiring U.S. contractors to hiring Iraqi contractors under Ambassador Khalilzad. And then it changed again under Ambassador Crocker into a counterinsurgency strategy. There's 5 large changes in 4 years. I think if trying to sustain efficiency in the face of changes of that magnitude is simply proved too tall an order.
Thank you. Another issue is uninterrupted oversight, which you stressed. I'm wondering whether you think there ought, going forward, to be an Inspector General dedicated in the future to contingent operations and perhaps a select congressional committee to look at these issues once Iraq and Afghanistan are behind us.
Well, I think there's sense to that, given the frequency with which contingency operations occur, and perhaps that special IG should be focused on domestic and international contingencies. There are obviously hurricanes, Katrina. It would have been nice perhaps to have had a special IG for that. But indeed the Department of Homeland Security created one internally. So yes, I think the experience of Iraq, Afghanistan, Katrina demonstrate that there's been a need for continuous oversight in this kind of environment. Disaster strikes, rebuilding begins quickly. For the last 5 years, it probably will continue.
And a final question for me is, one of the large issues, of course, that we've talked about and that's extensively documented in your report is security, the necessity for security to make reconstruction work effectively. What, in your judgment, is the appropriate mix, military vis-a-vis contractors, with regard to providing security so that these projects succeed?
There's not a cookie-cutter answer here. The fact is that conditions demand what that mix is, but what there needs to be is integration, an integrated decision-making process wherein the civilian component and the military components achieve a unity of purpose, and that requires some form of executive authority. I think that should flow out of a reform effort, because I don't think the reform efforts we see now are coordinated enough, integrated enough to yield this kind of outcome.
Another interesting point that we will be facing very rapidly is, as the troops draw down in Iraq, one of the key concerns is the cost of security. For the costs that we've cataloged to date have all been calculated on the fact that we've had roughly 150,000 troops. And when we talk about PSDs protecting the various officials that conduct reconstruction, they do so within a pocket of security provided by the military, and that is a cost that is not actually calculated. So when we say $6.5 billion was spent on private security, that's in addition to all of the sunk costs of all of these troops. So when we go out with PSDs, it's within a pocket of a Stryker group or, the Humvees with an entire group of military. As you take those military away in Iraq, if they continue to do certain levels of reconstruction, especially in the provinces, while they will depend a little bit on Iraqi army and Iraqi police, the question then becomes, how expensive is private security? And the real key is, as long as people know what the cost will be, and as long as they're willing to bear that cost, then that's a strategy that can be employed. But part of the problem is the true costs are not really known. And so one of our fears in 2008 and 2009 is we're going to reach a point where we're going to have to use private security, and the costs could escalate dramatically.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clark. Commissioner Zackheim?
Yes, thanks. We've been talking about huge sums of money. I recall in 2003 having a discussion with a top CPA official who said he was going to be asking for about $25 billion. My notion was probably closer to what the World Bank had said about absorptive capacity of Iraq, which is about a fifth of that. Mm-hmm. My question to you is, could Iraq really absorb the kind of money we were throwing at it, number one? And how do we think about absorptive capacity for Afghanistan or any future contingency?
Great point. Absorptive capacity is a key issue to think about in deciding how much aid to offer. And I agree with you. Iraq did not have the absorptive capacity for 25 or 18 billion as it came down to, or for that matter, barely 5. And at that time, because as I said, their army was fired, most of the senior government was fired. It was essentially a U.S.-driven endeavor, subcontracted out, and that required capacity building, not a focus of the IRF program, and so the absorptive capacity was as low as it's been in the last 6 years, and how it applies to Afghanistan. Hugely important question, because this is a country that doesn't have the kind of bureaucracy or operations or resources that Iraq has, and therefore will have a much more gradual or much lower absorptive capacity.
Let me ask you a slightly different question. Right now we have a joint contracting command for both Iraq and Afghanistan. Two-part question. First, in your view, should there be a separate contracting command for Afghanistan? And secondly, should there be a government-wide contracting organization for Afghanistan?
Yes, for sure on the first question. The focus is going to be Afghanistan. It's headquartered in Iraq. There needs to be a contracting headquarters in Kabul that is its own entity that answers to up the chain for its own actions for what goes on in Afghanistan. I think that your second point I would choose first to implement a CFAR. A government-wide contracting effort would just mean taking everybody out there and trying to get them all around the table and get them to agree to moving forward and what the contracting strategy is. I think an easier way is say, here are the 10 rules that everyone follows for contracting in Afghanistan. Follow them. That yields a strategy.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dov. Commissioner Kostaitis?
I want to make the point that it wasn't that we weren't warned that these projects were not the best way to go in Iraq. You in your report, oh, I'm sorry. It's not that we weren't warned that these projects weren't necessarily the right way to go in Iraq in terms of absorptive capacity. The U.S., in your report, you referred to the USAID Director Nastios, who called the list of projects a recipe for disaster.
That's right.
And he didn't keep that opinion to himself. He said it flouted the lessons learned from previous international development experience. He said you need money for elections, for local governance, for the university, for health care. And he got an angry call, you report, from Bremer, speaking of individuals accountable, saying he was trying to destroy the IRF 2 plan. And Bremer didn't heed Nastios's advice, according to your report. So I don't know, what's the fix for that problem? That's personality to personality, and whether somebody's so hard-headed that they don't listen to advice from somebody who has some experience in the real world. So I don't even need a comment on that. It's just an observation. Senator Collins pointed out, and I had this as one of my questions, that you did this in an audit. You found that for reasons of security, mismanagement, cost overruns, that we terminated 1,262 contracts and task orders, either for default or convenience, during the course of Reconstruction. And of the nearly $1 billion in value of these contracts, the government had already paid $600 million, apparently. And some of these projects were apparently near completion, but most of them weren't. That's right. So here's the question. How much of that $600 million do we get back, or is that permanently lost?
It's probably mostly permanently lost.
It is.
And this was an issue I started raising early on during my trip when I saw projects like these falling off the rails. I'd say, we got to default.
Yeah.
Stop terminating for convenience, which is, when you terminate a contractor for convenience, you pay all their costs, all their cost of leaving, closing down, closing up shop, and this is a contractor who's messed up, and that didn't sit well with me, and so I started urging for more defaults, and more started to come. But even so, the fact is, unless you paper the wrongdoing very well in the contract file, recovery on a termination for default is a very lengthy litigation process that the Department of Justice usually takes a pass on.
It's an excellent point. You need good contracting practices all along in order to be able to recover.
One additional point that we're finding in our investigations right now is the fact that if contracts were not written appropriately to begin with, which is a prescriptive recommendation, that it's very hard, if not impossible, to pursue that money again. If the contract said, go out and do work on this project, and it doesn't say what you expect from them. Part of the problem that we're having is when we go back with the contracting officers or go back to look for fraud and try to hold folks accountable, we can't, because the contract was written so loosely that the lawyers will say, well, they met the contract requirements. So that's another area that could be looked at to be tightened up.
I just want to thank you for your excellent work. You've done a terrific job, you and your office.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Linda. Commissioner Henke?
Could you expand on the notion of matching funds as it means going forward to Afghanistan? Is there any notion that there will be a matching program of any import?
That's a policy question, so I don't know with respect to Afghanistan. It's very important policy that has been implemented in the last supplemental in Iraq, and I think should continue to be, to the extent that the United States continues to appropriate funds. Afghanistan, as we've said over and over again, is such a different situation because it's, unlike Iraq, one of the poorest countries, has no natural resources, and so I think the analysis, the policy analysis, is going to be much different.
Okay. Ms. Cruz, could you speak a little bit more about your idea of conditionality and what that might mean in the setting of Afghanistan?
We looked at conditionality as an office when we were doing the quarterly reports, and one of the things that was not really put in place early on, and that in the last 2 years we have seen, is any sort of requirement for agreements by the receiving government to do something in exchange for the project that they're being given. And this is standard international development practice. One of the reasons why the United Nations and the World Bank were reluctant to pour a lot of money into Iraq in the beginning, because part of the point of pouring the money in is not to necessarily build the plant. It's the act of getting that money in there that gets the government engaged, that gets them engaged, lets them understand how to pursue future grants. It's the sustainability question, you know, giving someone fish versus giving them a fishing rod. And so the idea of conditionality was never applied in Iraq. I know it was considered a couple of times, but in the end we gave $50 billion without requiring anything. And so it could be something as simple as requiring the government of Iraq to sign a memorandum of agreement ensuring that they will provide doctors that will operate the $20 million hospital that we are providing for them in a certain province. And while those are things that are now being pursued on an ad hoc basis, if that was done as a condition of the contract, before we will build, before we give you the the $15 billion to develop your Iraqi army and your Iraqi police, you must make sure that the militias are removed from the police and that the types of screening or vetting for the police officers meet a certain requirement. So there's a lot of different ways to do that, both in soft projects and in hard projects, and it's just was never done in Iraq, and it's something that perhaps in Afghanistan would work.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you both very much.
Thanks, Bob. Commissioner Tiefer.
General, I can't get over the 2 years of intense labor your staff put in and the historic nature of these interviews. If I can ask you about a quote from Deputy Secretary Armitage's interview, which to me sounds like it's the moment where the alliance between Rumsfeld and Bremer, which had gone from bungling to bungling and disaster to disaster, finally cracks. Secretary Armitage said to you about a meeting. Dr. Rice turned to Rumsfeld. She said, Don, would you call Jerry and have him do X, Y, or Z? And he said, no, Bremer, doesn't work for me. She said, yes, he does. Who does he work for? And he, Rumsfeld, says, he works for the NSC. That is, she said, he works for you, and he said, no, he works for you. What did this mean, and what was its significance?
Excuse me, that occurred in the fall of 2003 when another policy change was underway. And that policy change was driven in part by perceptions in Washington about the September 8th Washington Post op-ed that Ambassador Bremer published regarding the CPA 7-point plan for transferring sovereignty to Iraq. It caused alarm bells to go off in certain places in this town, as we point out in the report. And there's dispute, as our report points out, about whether and to what extent Ambassador Bremer had briefed Secretary Rumsfeld about that plan. It also caused the creation of something called the White House Iraq Stabilization Group, and that led to the deployment of Ambassador Blackwell as head of that group to Iraq to review what was going on. And he came back very concerned. And as he says in the sentence preceding the quote you just read, he said there was a very serious estrangement within the interagency at that point, emphasizing again, very serious. And I think that quotation reflects that estrangement.
One other quick quote. Some people have found it their favorite. President Bush gave the authority in NSPD 26 to Secretary Rumsfeld, and he says a little later, he's quoted as saying, if you think we're going to spend $1 billion of our money over there, you are sadly mistaken. And as your report notes, at that point we spent $50 billion, eventually. What did you understand was going on when we gave Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld control of reconstruction, post-war reconstruction?
Well, I think that was something that the Department of Defense had argued for and discussed in the fall of 2002, well before that actual vesting event occurred in January of 2003, just two months and a few days before the invasion. And I think that is symptomatic ultimately of two things. One, the planning for Iraq was a Department of Defense enterprise. It was an invasion. So, and with that came Phase 4, which is part of any military operation. Phase 4 is about what you do after achieving victory on the grounds. And so, but the next step beyond Phase 4 is what you do about stabilizing the country. And with NSPD 26, the Secretary of Defense secured for the Department of Defense the authority to manage that phase. And as we've discussed, that phase changed quickly because, as the report points out, widespread looting led to widespread chaos, led to collapse of the ministries, and led to the replacement of the gentleman who was engaging in that conversation with the Secretary of Defense, Lieutenant General Jay Garner, who was leading ORHA, the temporary organization, then trying to deal with the looting, to try and deal with the burning ministries, to try and deal with no government, to deal with rioting soldiers. Ex-soldiers, I should say.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And this wraps up this part of the testimony, or this panel. Stuart, there are very few people that can wear the title of being a historian. A lot of us try to say, well, we know the history, we must be the historian. You've walked both personally and through your many products. I'd certainly give you kudos as a true historian, and that's ultimately about as good a compliment as I can give anyway. And this group, this commission, clearly is very appreciative and continues or will continue to work with your exceptionally talented staff, and please pass that on to all of them, our appreciation for their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Thibeault.
That is a bipartisan sentiment.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Thibeault. Thank you, Commissioners.
Our live coverage of the first public hearing of the bipartisan commission established to study wartime contracting practices in Iraq and Afghanistan. A break right now, we believe a lunch break, but awaiting official word on how long this break may last. And our coverage, of course, live coverage on C-SPAN, will continue when this public hearing resumes. In the meantime, a couple of items in the news today. The Associated Press reporting that President Barack Obama says that very modest differences should not get in the way of swift congressional passage of a massive economic stimulus package. Mr. Obama spoke today to reporters as he and Vermont Governor Jim Douglas, the Republican vice chair of the National Governors Association, were about to meet in the Oval Office about the plan. Governor Douglas agreed with the president, saying that a stimulus package is essential to getting the country moving again. Also from the AP, President Obama says he absolutely stands by Tom Daschle's nomination for Secretary of Health and Human Services. The president gave that one-word answer today about the matter during the meeting with Governor Douglas. Specifically, President Obama was asked whether he still backed Mr. Daschle. in light of the disclosure that the former Senate Majority Leader failed to pay more than $120,000 in taxes. Mr. Daschle is the president's second cabinet choice to face tax problems. Again, that from the AP today. Getting word now that this first public hearing of the bipartisan commission to look into wartime contracting practices will be back at 1:15. So a little more than a half hour from now, a lunch break, and our live coverage will continue here on C-SPAN at that time.